Part 1. The Vanishing Trail. The story began on a windless November morning, when the town of Redford seemed as quiet as it had been a century ago. The leaves, brittle and colorless, lay scattered across the sidewalks like discarded paper from a case file. In the heart of the town, the police station sat as a squat, aging building of brick and narrow windows. Inside, an air-controlled chaos ruled. Papers piled on desks, coffee cups left half full, and walls plastered with mugshots, maps, and strings of red yarn connecting them in constellations of human deceit. Redford had always been the kind of place where crimes were more likely to be petty theft or drunken fights outside a bar. But 3 weeks earlier, something had happened that shifted the town's reality. A man named Thomas Rayner, a local contractor with no criminal record, had vanished without leaving a trace. His truck had been found parked neatly outside his small warehouse, the keys in the ignition. The driver's seat slid back, as if someone taller had been driving. The lock on the warehouse door was intact, and nothing seemed missing. At first, it felt like a case of someone simply walking away from their life. But as days passed, inconsistencies piled up. Thomas's bank accounts remained untouched, his phone inactive, his friends and co-workers adamant that he'd been preparing for a busy winter season. The last person to see him had been a gas station clerk who remembered him stopping for coffee the morning before he disappeared. That image of a man sipping coffee from a foam cup, unaware that it might be his last ordinary act, would replay in the minds of detectives for weeks. Detective Erin Caldwell was assigned the case, a woman known in the department for her meticulous attention to detail. She worked methodically, starting from the warehouse. The building smelled faintly of sawdust and engine oil. The floor swept clean, except for a thin trail of dirt leading from the back door to a corner where several wooden pallets were stacked. Behind them, she noticed a small scuff mark on the wall, fresh, with traces of something metallic embedded in the plaster. A closer look revealed it was part of curing, broken clean off. The evidence room grew fuller each day. A handful of fingerprints were lifted from the truck, none matching Thomas. Surveillance cameras along his usual routes showed him driving normally until a point about 3 miles from the warehouse, where he turned down a small industrial road. There were no cameras past that point. In the following days, Erin's investigation took her into the cold edges of Redford, where abandoned factories cast shadows over cracked asphalt. She spoke to night shift workers who swore they hadn't seen anyone unusual, to security guards who admitted their cameras hadn't worked in months, and to old residents who remembered when those same buildings had been alive with machinery. The search expanded beyond the county. The state police sent a team with specialized equipment, combing nearby woods, dredging drainage ditches, and even scanning the riverbank for signs of a body. But nothing surfaced, no blood, no torn clothing, no personal belongings. It was as if Thomas Rayner had stepped into a pocket of the world where light couldn't reach, and the door had closed behind him. Erin began to suspect that the key to the case wasn't in the places they had searched, but in the spaces no one had thought to look. Every evening, she returned to her desk and spread out the case files, building timelines, noting inconsistencies, mapping the last known movements of every person connected to Thomas. A pattern was forming, faint and fragmented, but it was there, linking the disappearance to a series of thefts from construction sites in neighboring towns. Thefts that had stopped abruptly the week Thomas vanished. Her gut told her this wasn't a coincidence. Someone had wanted Thomas gone, and they had planned it so well that no trace was left for the casual eye. But Erin wasn't a casual observer. She knew that every crime left an echo, sometimes too faint for most to hear, but always there if you knew where to listen. Part 2. Traces in the dust. Erin knew the trail was cold, but cold trails still held imprints. She returned to the warehouse one more time, determined to find something everyone else had overlooked. The place had been searched twice already, but the longer she stood in the silent building, the more it felt like the space itself was holding its breath. The pallets she'd noticed earlier were moved carefully, each revealing more of the scuff wall. When she crouched to inspect the baseboard, she saw a fine powder clinging to the wood. It was darker than sawdust, almost gray. She scraped a small sample into an evidence vial and sent it to the state lab. The results, which came back 2 days later, confirmed her suspicion. It was powdered concrete mixed with microscopic flecks of copper. That combination wasn't common. It matched industrial work done on a series of warehouses 30 miles east, near a transport hub known for its maze-like storage units. The new lead pulled her out of Redford and into territory where local jurisdiction meant little. Those warehouses sat in a no-man's land of overlapping county lines, where enforcement was inconsistent and property records were deliberately murky. Many of the businesses operating there were shell companies, legitimate on paper, but essentially ghost fronts. Aaron spent hours combing through corporate filings, following one registration to another until the same set of names began reappearing. The names were tied to a contractor who had once worked with Thomas Rayner on a municipal project. That project had been marred by budget overruns and unaccounted materials, but no charges had ever been filed. The connection was too thin to prove anything, but it was enough to justify a closer look. She visited the transport hub under the guise of following up on stolen construction equipment. The air there was heavy with diesel fumes, the ground a patchwork of oil stains. Rows of shipping containers were stacked like toy blocks, each tagged with a fading stencil of its contents, or at least what they were supposed to contain. A few units were locked with new, shiny padlocks. Others sat slightly ajar, doors rusting in place. One particular unit caught her attention. Its lock was newer than the others, but the hinges showed fresh scrapes, as though it had been opened and shut repeatedly in the last week. The container belonged to a company listed as Northwell Logistics, which on paper handled the import of building materials. Aaron checked the company's tax ID and found that it shared a mailing address with an abandoned office in downtown Redford. The office was 2 blocks from Thomas's warehouse. Back at her desk, she assembled everything she had: the powdered concrete, the shared addresses, the contractor connection, the sudden halt of thefts. A picture was forming, one of a quiet network moving stolen materials through legitimate channels until something or someone interfered. She began to suspect that Thomas had either stumbled onto their operation or had been part of it until something went wrong. 2 weeks later, a call came from a small-town sheriff 50 miles north. A hiker had found something near an old rail line, a shallow depression in the ground, partially hidden by fallen branches. Inside was a weather tarp wrapped tightly. Inside that tarp was a set of work boots caked in dried mud and concrete dust. They were Thomas's size. The boots went straight to the lab. Soil analysis showed the same copper-infused concrete dust found in the warehouse. Fibers from the tarp matched a batch sold to Northwell Logistics 6 months earlier. The evidence was stacking up, but Aaron knew that without a body or direct witness, it was all circumstantial. Still, the boots shifted the tone of the investigation. What had been a missing persons case was now leaning toward a homicide inquiry. She began re-interviewing everyone tied to Thomas, this time looking for micro-reactions, inconsistencies in timelines, financial anomalies. And that's when she found a bank deposit. 2 weeks before his disappearance, Thomas had received a transfer of $14,300 from an account registered to a different name, but using his old business address. The transaction was marked as equipment payment, but no such equipment was ever delivered. The account holder's name came up in a sealed narcotics case from 5 years earlier. Someone tied to smuggling construction-grade chemicals for meth production. The circle was tightening. Part 3, The Silent Witness. Winter crept in, and with it, the case took on a colder, more dangerous tone. Aaron began spending late nights in the evidence room, retracing her steps, reviewing every scrap of data. The walls were covered in maps and photographs, lines of yarn tracing possible movements and connections. One corner was dedicated entirely to Thomas's last day, a clock-phase diagram mapping his every confirmed action until the moment he disappeared. She realized there was one window of time that no one had accounted for, a 28-minute gap between when Thomas left the gas station and when his truck was seen on the industrial road. 28 minutes in a town where you could cross from one side to the other in less than 10. That gap became her obsession. She pulled traffic cam footage, pored over business security tapes, and even examined weather data from that morning. On the 3rd day, she found it, a grainy reflection in a window belonging to a pawn shop. The angle was poor, but it showed Thomas's truck turning into a side alley, followed by a dark van with no plates. Minutes later, only the van emerged. The pawn shop owner didn't remember anything unusual, but the timestamp matched the gap perfectly. Aaron traced the alley on foot. It led to a set of abandoned garages. The doors rusted shut, except for one with a newer chain lock. Inside was nothing, at least nothing visible. But when she knelt to examine the floor, she found faint scrape marks leading toward the back wall. Behind a loose panel was a hidden crawl space no bigger than a closet. It was empty now, but the smell of gasoline and machine oil lingered. A single length of heavy-duty rope lay coiled in the corner, stained dark. The rope went to the lab, where testing revealed traces of blood, too degraded for a full DNA profile, but consistent with a male. By now, Aaron was sure the disappearance had been a coordinated abduction. The precision, the absence of random mistakes, the calculated cleaning of every scene. It all pointed to professionals. She began working the case on the other end, pulling unsolved theft reports from across the state. A pattern emerged. Every site hit had ties to infrastructure work, bridges, warehouses, industrial plants. And each theft happened within weeks of a temporary subcontractor joining the project. That subcontractor was always registered under a different LLC, but the contact number remained the same. The number was a prepaid cell that had been activated and discarded repeatedly. But on one occasion, it had pinged a cell tower near Thomas's warehouse, less than an hour before he vanished. The case was no longer about one missing man. It was about an organized theft ring that had now escalated to murder. Part 4, Into the Web. The deeper Aaron dug, the more the case resembled a spider's web. Thin strands stretching outward, nearly invisible, but all connected to a single dark center. She knew she couldn't take down the network by force. The operators were cautious, insulated by layers of plausible deniability. The only way in was to make herself part of their system. Using a confidential informant, Aaron learned that the group was quietly recruiting skilled labor for an upcoming construction job outside the state. The informant, a former heavy machinery operator, introduced her to a man known only as Cal. He was broad-shouldered, with hands like slabs of stone, and his eyes assessed the way a jeweler studies a counterfeit diamond. She told him she had experience in site inspections, quality control, and procurement, skills that would seem useful to a crew trying to launder stolen materials through legitimate contracts. Cal said little, but a week later, she received a text from a prepaid phone telling her to be at a truck depot on the outskirts of the city. She arrived in plain work clothes, no badge, no weapon. The depot was a forest of trailers and shipping containers, the hum of diesel engines mixing with the metallic clang of loading ramps. She was given a clipboard with falsified invoices and told to ride in the passenger seat of a flatbed hauling steel beams. The route led them away from main highways and into industrial backroads that cut through abandoned manufacturing zones. Finally, they arrived at a warehouse much larger than any she'd seen connected to Northwell Logistics. The structure was fortified, its windows painted over, security cameras swiveling in slow arcs. Inside, the scale of the operation became clear. Rows of stolen equipment, generators, copper spools, prefabricated panels, were stacked neatly alongside legitimate shipments. The two were indistinguishable without knowing what to look for, and that was the genius of it. Legitimate goods hid the stolen ones like camouflage. Aaron noted everything. Serial numbers scratched off in uniform patterns. Identical zip ties used to bundle both legal and illicit goods, and a system of colored chalk marks on pallets that indicated their true destination. She kept her demeanor neutral, never asking questions that would reveal too much curiosity. Her role was to verify paperwork. But she noticed a small, locked room in the far corner of the warehouse. It was guarded casually, as if to suggest it wasn't important, which made her certain it was. During her second shift on site, she slipped away under the pretense of checking inventory. The door to the locked room was steel, the type used in secure storage for evidence or high-value items. A clipboard hung outside, its last entry marked from a week prior. She couldn't open it without blowing her cover, but she memorized the lock's make and serial number. The next day, she ran that number through the department's internal systems. It was a model often used in municipal storage, but one identical lock had turned up in a burglary at a city impound lot 2 years earlier, an unsolved case. Her instincts screamed that Thomas had been here, perhaps even held in that room. But without proof, it was still just a shadow in her mind. Part 5. The Break in the Chain. It was mid-January when the case finally cracked. A storm rolled through the region, flooding low-lying industrial areas. The warehouse where Aaron had been working was hit, forcing the crew to move shipments earlier than planned. In the rush, mistakes were made. One of the stolen generators fell from a forklift, cracking its casing. Inside was a hidden compartment containing documents, shipping manifests, pay ledgers, and photographs. Among the photographs was one that froze Aaron where she stood. Thomas Rayner, sitting in a chair, his hands bound in front of him, eyes open but vacant. The photo was time-stamped the day after he disappeared. Aaron managed to slip the photograph into her clipboard without being seen. That night, she met with her commanding officer in a quiet diner, sliding the evidence across the table. The image transformed the case from a circumstantial puzzle into a prosecutable homicide. A joint task force was assembled, blending local police, state investigators, and federal agents specializing in organized theft. Warrants were issued, but the challenge was timing. If the crew caught even a hint of the crackdown, they could vanish with weeks' worth of stolen goods. On the day of the raid, Erin was embedded inside the warehouse. She kept her phone hidden, waiting for the go signal. When it came, the building erupted in chaos, agents pouring in through doors and skylights, shouting commands, forcing workers to the ground. She moved straight to the locked room. With a master key provided by the task force, she swung it open, the hinges groaning. The space was empty except for a rust-stained chair, a length of rope, and a scrap of tarp identical to the one found with Thomas's boots. There was no body. Disappointment threatened to crush her, but forensics swept in, photographing and bagging every item. The rope had traces of blood and hair. The tarp fragment held fibers matching Thomas's work jacket. In the weeks that followed, arrests were made across 3 states. The theft ring structure unraveled, revealing layers of shell companies, offshore accounts, and a network of middlemen who kept the true masterminds insulated. Part 6, the unfinished case. Despite the victories, one truth haunted Erin. Thomas's body was never found. She scoured old maps, cross-referenced shipping routes, and followed faint trails of tips from informants who whispered about deep drops and dry wells where inconvenient problems were left. Her search took her to a decommissioned quarry 2 counties over. The place was a scar in the earth, its walls streaked with rust and mineral stains. Water pooled at the bottom, opaque and green. Divers went down, fighting low visibility and jagged debris. They found nothing, at least nothing they could recover in one day. The quarry was added to a list of possible disposal sites, but weather and budget delays meant it would be months before a full search could be mounted. Erin visited it alone one evening. Standing at the rim, the wind cutting through her coat, she thought about the boots, the photograph, the room in the warehouse, and the quiet resignation in Thomas's eyes and that frozen image. Cases like this never truly ended. They lingered, unfinished, echoing in the minds of those who worked them. Erin filed her final report knowing it would remain open-ended, a chapter without closure. But she also knew that webs, no matter how carefully woven, eventually unravel. And when the last strand snapped, she'd be ready.